Paine, I think, also shows you how that radical form of liberalism can lead to a much greater belief in the power and role of government, ultimately, so that you can see in the course of his career a development from what is essentially radical libertarianism to the early roots of welfare state thinking.
With Tom Paine, we arrive at a figure who is central, might be a little bit too strong, but important in two revolutions. I mean, he was the author of Common Sense and the Crisis over here in the American Revolution, and then marvelously found himself in France just at the right time to participate in the opening acts of the French Revolution and to get himself eventually thrown in prison. Mm-hmm. Paine raises the question, what is his relation to the American Revolution, and what's the American Revolution's relation to American conservatism these days? What role should the American founding or the American Revolution, call it what you will, play in today's formulations of conservatism?
Well, I think that the order that we as conservatives are trying to conserve is impossible to understand without the American founding, and more than that, it owes itself to the American founding. And Paine understood and articulated something very important about the American founding. Not everything about it. His idea of the founding was much more radical, I think, than the founding itself, more radical than Jefferson even, and certainly more radical than the kind of average view of the American living at the time, and even of the American founders.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Paine saw the American founding as a kind of philosophical event. It's also why he found himself in France when he did, and why he had that great timing in the Age of Revolutions. Paine said himself that he was a revolutionary more than an American. That meant, and of course it's impossible to avoid that. Paine only arrived in America a year and a half before the Declaration of Independence. And so
he had an uncanny
yes,
eye for revolution.
He had an extraordinary ability to find himself in the right place at the right time. What he believed was happening in America was the dawn of a new age, a kind of essentially inevitable age that could only be stopped by the worst kind of despotism, which he thought is what was happening, is what the actions of the British meant in America. And what that age meant was the dawning of a political order that answered to political ideas, and especially to Enlightenment ideas about equality, about the freedom of the individual. Paine held to, I think it's fair to say, the most radical form of a Lockean liberalism, which is not itself the most radical form of liberalism by any means. And he found himself at home in America and thought that the American Revolution should be understood in terms of the first chapter in an era of revolutions that would spread around the world. And he very much connected the American Revolution and the French Revolution. The connection between those two was a controversial question in America, was in some sense the controversial question of the era of the French Revolution here. For Paine, there was no question. It was all about opening this new age of individual liberation, of equality and liberty and democracy. And of course, that was partially right. And so the spirit of Paine is very much alive in anyone who wants to preserve the spirit of the American Revolution. I think it doesn't account for everything about the Revolution, and so it isn't everything that conservatives should conserve. And also, Paine's disposition and Paine's attitude about knowledge and the role of policy in politics isn't really what conservatives try to conserve or ever have. His disposition is radical. That is, he was first and foremost outraged at the bad and believed that it could be undone only by overthrowing the entirety of the political order that we inherited and starting over on the right foundations. In that sense, he was literally a radical. He wanted to go to the core, to the root, to the beginning, and thought that you could almost return to a kind of state of nature and from it build in the right way and get to the right kinds of institutions. That's not exactly what the American Revolution did. The American Revolution believed that it had more to draw on than that, and so tried to draw the best out of the English tradition and to build new ideas upon that, and to build a new political order upon that.
Where do you draw the line there? I mean, Paine is in favor of, human equality, liberty, natural rights, consent of the governed, social contract, limited government in some large sense.
Yeah.
of the term, just like Jefferson, just like Adams, just like
Well,
Hamilton,
Paine was a
just like
believer in
Madison.
absolute democracy.
Yeah.
He didn't believe in the division of powers. He didn't believe he was an opponent of the Constitution, though he was very careful not to say too much about it. He certainly didn't believe in the bicameral legislature and in federalism the way it took shape in the Constitution. He was a believer that opening up democracy, allowing it to have its way, was the right approach to government, and that anything else was a compromise with realities that didn't need to be compromised with anymore, and so shouldn't be compromised with. So I think Paine was much more radical than Jefferson and much less practical than Jefferson, and certainly much more so than Madison, and let alone Hamilton and Adams.
And certainly in his later career, when he became openly anti-Christian, he far exceeded the bounds of American opinion and even of American radical opinion.
Paine, I think, also shows you how that radical form of liberalism can lead to a much greater belief in the power and role of government, ultimately, so that you can see in the course of his career a development from what is essentially radical libertarianism to the early roots of welfare state thinking. And by 1800, he's writing about creating a system by which government will help the poor. His belief always was that if you kind of liberate the right principles, all these problems should be solved, including poverty, including war. But when it didn't happen by itself, Paine came to believe that government could help it happen, if it was the right sort of government, if it was a fully democratic government. And so he writes in an essay called Agrarian Justice in 1797 what is essentially a kind of description of a proto-welfare state that provides benefits directly to the public to alleviate poverty. That's not where Burke was ever headed. And the path from radical individualism to statism is much easier for Paine, and I think is much easier for the people who have followed Paine, for the sort of more radical approach to the liberal society that followed Paine, because ultimately a lot of it is about ends. And when the means that Paine believed in didn't achieve those ends, the followers of Paine and even of Jefferson became open to far different kinds of means, because the utopian ends were the point for them. And so I think you start to see in Paine's own career how the belief in limited government is the first thing to give way when it turns out not to work in practice the way that he had hoped.
But would he say in defense of himself that both the scheme of agrarian justice and the sort of beginnings of a welfare state in the rights of man are meant for England? I mean, meant for a society that has been aristocratic and has been warped by the experience of aristocracy, but not meant for a more natural society in his terms as the United States?
Well, I wouldn't say that they were not meant for the United States. Paine and Agrarian Justice, in one of the later editions of it in 1802, there's an American introduction to Agrarian Justice, and he seemed to think it would have some value in America. Now, Paine thought America did have a kind of aristocratic past, at least certain parts of America, that had to be overcome. So I think he would make a form of that case, but ultimately that case amounts to saying that this wouldn't be necessary in a perfect society, but it is necessary in a real society. That means that it's necessary. Every society has its history and its limitations. And the idea that you can start over and not have to confront the burdens of the past was certainly something Paine always hoped for, but I think it's fair to say it's something that is ultimately not possible.
Which would you say is the more American debate, though, between Paine and, say, Adams, or his critics in America, of which he had many, precisely because he was a simple government man, not a complex government man, didn't really trust, or didn't think checks and balances were really necessary, and that kind of thing. French almost in his thinking, as far as that goes. Is that the debate, or is the Burke-Paine debate the American debate? Well,
I think that the Burke-Paine debate is actually a deeper form of that same debate. I think Burke and Paine brought out in each other really their deepest views. They forced one another to think about the roots of their beliefs, and the view that Burke is articulating is very similar to the one that Adams that argues against Paine. Burke is also a believer in complexity, and ultimately because he thinks that complexity arose for a reason, and that the reason is probably not entirely knowable to us. So that, again, we should start with working institutions, keep those, and build on them in ways that try to address their problems. That's going to result in a very complicated government, in a government that has all sorts of arms and legs. It's not clear what its various vestiges are achieving exactly. Burke was a reformer of some of those when it was clear they were excessive. But he also believed in maintaining them more or less because they existed and were working. And that certainly wasn't Paine's view. What the Burke-Paine debate allows you to see that I think his debates with... There was no real debate with Adams, of course. Paine never really quite answered Adams. And Adams just insulted him in very amusing ways, but it didn't exactly get down to profound ideas.
Like the age of Paine,
Yeah,
no
that's
E.
right. He loved that his name was Paine. It was such a wonderful thing for John Adams. The Burke-Paine debate gets to ideas and ultimately gets to the question of how we should think about the sources and the roots of politics. And for Burke, the key fact is that politics has to begin from the given world. And that means that it has to be a politics of generational connections, that it has to be a politics of gradual improvement. Paine simply rejected that, including the generational question. Paine makes explicit something that a lot of other liberal thinkers don't, which is that the state of nature idea as a source of our understanding of rights means that there is no importance to the connection between generations. Every person has to be thought of like the first person in the world. To Burke, this was just sheer insanity, and it would be impossible to build a society by beginning from that premise. The Burke-Paine debate shows us, therefore, that our heritage, our inheritance, is very complicated. We want to believe and do in the sort of idea of rights that Paine articulates. But the roots of that idea, as Paine lays them out, I think are not ultimately supportable. And those ideas come from somewhere deeper, from somewhere further in our intellectual heritage, and in British history and in Western civilization, in places that a lot of liberals were not comfortable talking about then and are not comfortable talking about now. The danger of not talking about it, of not seeing those roots, is that it can very easily become utilitarian if you have no roots. It really can be all about ends. And at that point, you lose the case for limits. And that's exactly what happens in Paine's own thinking.